In our next session, we will examine landmark First Amendment cases. Our panelists for this session are Shawn Peters and Mary Beth Tinker. We welcome again Duquesne University President Ken Gormley, who will moderate this session to introduce our panelists.
In this special segment, we'll hear from two people who've been deeply involved in historic efforts to protect First Amendment rights. Dr. Shawn Peters, involved in Wisconsin v. Yoder, and Mary Beth Tinker, one of the plaintiffs in the historic Tinker v. Des Moines Independent School Community School District in 1969. Dr. Peters is the author of the Yoder case, Religious Liberty, Education, and Parental Rights. And just to set the stage for a moment, this case, which is one of my favorite in all constitutional law, involved 3 Amish students from 3 different Amish families in New Glarus, Wisconsin, who stopped attending public school after 8th grade in keeping with their family's religious beliefs and their convictions that it was important to work on the family farm after grade school rather than attending public high school in order to prepare for a life in rural Amish community life. The students' parents were convicted of violating Wisconsin's compulsory school attendance laws, which required students to attend school until age 16. They believed, the parents, that this would endanger their own salvation and that of their children if they were forced to comply with this law, contrary to their religious beliefs. So they went on to challenge the Wisconsin law, and the U.S. Supreme Court ended up ruling in the parents' favor, finding that the First Amendment free exercise clause protected their decision. And I would note that this really spawned a large, broader homeschooling movement in the United States, this case, and was transformational in many ways. Dr. Peters has chronicled this work. He's a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to ask Dr. Shawn Peters to tell a little bit about this historic case.
Thanks, Ken. And can I confess that I've been sitting here for 2 days completely terrified as to how I'm going to talk about the free exercise clause and Amish farmers after all of this great stimulating discussion about fake news and the media and all these other things. I will try in some way to contextualize this in a way that's interesting. As President Gormley mentioned, Yoder is a case that was decided by the US Supreme Court in 1972, and the legal issues were relatively straightforward, at least on the surface. Wisconsin, like almost every state, had a compulsory school attendance law that mandated school attendance until the age of 16, and these are laws that have been around for now 150 years, and they're just meant for, the government has them in order to ensure that people are ready to function in society, whether that's through a robust understanding of citizenship, knowing how to read and write. So these are common laws in every state, not only Wisconsin. However, the Old Order Amish in New Glarus, Wisconsin, and Old Order Amish, as the name suggests, especially conservative Amish, believed that school attendance beyond the age of 14 was a problem. And their belief, according to their Ordnung, the Ordnung is the sort of rules of the community, stated that if you had sort of high school education, that would threaten the faith community. Students would become too worldly. They would just learn things that would sort of pull them away from their faith. So we have a collision, as often happens in great, difficult First Amendment cases, between two actually pretty good and reasonable interests. The state's interest in making sure that students are educated, that's a pretty good interest, and also the religious liberty of the Amish. So there was a prosecution of the parents of Frida Yoder, Aidan Yetzi, and Wallace Miller. And it was interesting when I started writing about this case, I tend to ask kind of dumb questions. That's a good way to start out. And I didn't know a lot about the Amish before I wrote this book, but one thing I knew is that there are no Amish lawyers, and Amish don't believe in going to law, using the courts or the political system. And I thought, how in the world did we have a landmark First Amendment case involving the Amish if they don't believe in going to law? And it turns out that advocates came in and represented the Amish. They had some friends who said, you're involved in this legal dispute, we're going to help you out. This group called the National Coalition for Amish Religious Freedom that came in definitely partly with noble intentions to help the Amish and to help protect their religious liberty, but also a degree of self-interest. They were involved in other, sort of litigation and public policy debates over protecting and encouraging parochial Catholic education. So they sort of championed this case and took it to the Supreme Court. There were accusations that this outside group, there was an editorial in Commonweal that accused this outside group of, quote, using the Amish. The case goes to the Supreme Court. Chief Justice Warren Burger writes the opinion protecting the religious liberty of the Amish, and it's often thought of as this kind of high watermark for free exercise jurisprudence. It's probably the furthest extension of judicial protections for free exercise. There's been a diminution, you mentioned yesterday, Oregon versus Smith and other cases subsequently. And it was hailed as the salvation of the Amish in New Glarus. Now they were free to practice their faith without the interference of the state. And so I wrote this book, and I said, well, I live in Madison. It's maybe 20 or 25 minutes from New Glarus. I'm going to go down to New Glarus. I'm going to talk to some Amish people, and there aren't a lot of Amish people in New Glarus anymore. And it turns out they moved away, and they moved away in part because of the case, their participation in this case, because of their strictures about going to law, created division and dissent in the community. And in fact, Jonas Yoder, the person whose name is on that case, was one of the first people to leave. He moved to Missouri and said, somewhat famously, I quote this in my book, there was this kind of heartbreaking interview that he gave, and he said, I wish anybody else's name had been on this case other than mine, because the Amish value humility. Being the most famous Amish person in the United States is not a good thing. And for me, that fascinated me. We're talking about landmark cases, and I think a lot about how we move from landmark to landmark when we teach about the law and we talk about the law. And oftentimes it's important to just strip away some of the mythology behind these cases and to kind of look at who were involved, who were the parties, who were the actors, what were the social, political, and cultural forces that shaped them, and then what was the actual outcome. We did get this judicial precedent. It's funny that you mentioned homeschooling. I'm writing a book on homeschooling that's going to come out next spring. Thanks for the plug. So it's hugely important. Everybody knows Yoder talks about it. It's an important case, but it's also important to know the people, and that's why I'm so glad that you're here, to talk about the people as well. It's not just abstraction and theory. There are individuals whose lives are at stake. I think about that as well. My first book had been about the Jehovah's Witnesses in the Supreme Court. And again, looking at every First Amendment conference must mention the Jehovah's Witnesses. They're sort of unsung heroes of the First Amendment. They don't get talked about a lot because they're sort of unpopular and perceived of as being strange, yet those outliers, those people on the fringes or the margins of American society, especially as it relates to the Free Exercise Clause, polygamists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Amish farmers, faith healers, users of peyote. Those are the people who are really making that law and challenging the parameters of state power.
Thank you. That's really interesting, and it underscores the sincerity of the Yoder's religious belief about this, that they did it at their own peril, and it actually ended up driving them from their own community, but they felt so strongly about it, they did it.
Absolutely, yeah. That was and it's almost, the Amish are interesting to write about and to study and to just know, because they, and Justice Berger's opinion, it sort of oozes admiration for this noble yeoman, the Jeffersonian farmers and the Amish. And that's absolutely true. And that's actually one of the things, their very sincerity, I think, at least in the case of Jonas Yoder, really caused him to question why it was that he had, on the one hand, he wanted to practice his faith, but on the other hand, he had used the institution of the state, right? He used the courts, and so there was an ambivalence there. And for me as an historian, that's really interesting. And I don't know what the answer is or how he could have solved that, but as a storyteller, I really like that, because that's really complicated and difficult. And so it's not just a narrative of valor and triumph and success. It's something that there's an ambivalence or complication to it.
And I think you're right, Shawn, that getting to hear from the people themselves is a crucial part of this. And so we are really lucky to have with us today Mary Beth Tinker, who, and I'll just say a word and then I'll let you tell your story largely, Mary Beth, but I believe you were 13 years old, right, in 1965 during the height of the Vietnam War, when you and some other students in your school decided to wear black armbands to protest the war. The school board got wind of it, tried to do a preemptive strike to ban that. You wore it anyway and were sent home when you refused to take it off, as were some of the other students, and that led to a 4-year court battle till the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in Tinker v. Des Moines in 1969. And it's a famous, famous case, folks, where the court said that students do not shed their First Amendment rights at the schoolhouse gate. And what was particularly important was not just that this armband wasn't a piece of cloth, but it was a form of speech, but it was specifically a form of political speech, perhaps the most important type of speech in our country. And Mary Beth and I were talking at the dinner last night for speakers, and I told her I hadn't really thought of this, but it brought back a memory that I wore a black armband. I was a freshman, I think, in high school at St. Anselm's in Swissvale, and a bunch of us wore them, and you could say, well, what did you know about the war in Vietnam? And it was toward the end of things then. But I shared with Mary Beth that a girl in our class, still a friend, Denise Abraham, her brother had been killed. He had served in Vietnam, and shortly before that was brought home, and we all went to see him in a casket. And so, coincidentally, I just saw one of the members of the family. It was 50 years ago this month that he died in Vietnam, and the hurt is still there. So we didn't really know exactly what we were doing as kids, but we knew that we were hurt as a family, and that was our effort to express something. So tell us about, Mary Beth has continued her wonderful work and goes around the country talking, particularly to young folks about the importance of the speech and the First Amendment. So tell us your story.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that story, and thank you for having me here as part of this wonderful conference at this time when we really need civil dialogue, and I think everyone can agree that this has been a wonderful example of that. But yes, I was talking with some students at lunchtime, actually, about what motivates people to take a stand, what motivates people to use their First Amendment rights. And I was talking about the emotion, what you just talked about. You have a strong feeling, and so many young people today do have strong feelings, and they should be respected for that. And then that combined with having examples of people who do something about those feelings and take a stand about those feelings. And I was very lucky to have that in my life. I had been raised in the church, and my father was a minister, a Methodist minister. And so he felt very strongly that you should take your beliefs, your faith beliefs, and put them into action on earth. Don't wait for heaven. Just get busy right now and stand up for the things that you believe in, like love, brotherhood, and understanding, the things that we need so much today, and then combining that with the ideas that I got in school about democracy and equality and justice and those kinds of things also, it was a powerful example. So I had examples of that. And I think so many young people now, they have examples. We had the examples of the civil rights movement kids. Because in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, young people, 2,000 kids were arrested, black students, for standing up to the KKK and standing up against the white supremacists. And they were, I'm sure if some of you have seen those amazing photos. It's really a story of journalism and the free press. Because those photos then came into our living room, and we saw the kids who were so brave and stood up to the Klan, stood up to the dogs, the German Shepherd dogs that they were attacked by, and the water hoses. And so we had that example. And then in 1964 was also Freedom Summer, where young people went from all over the United States to Mississippi to help register African American voters. And they were called there by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Robert Moses and others. And when they got there, 3 of them were murdered. So my parents went to Mississippi that year, and again, they believed that you should put your beliefs into action. And they came home on my 12th birthday and told us about how the house they were in had been shot at, and all of this. You know, well, after Birmingham, the children were then punished, the children who stood up in Birmingham and spoke up, by the KKK, because, of course, their headquarters, their church, was bombed. And that was in 1963. So in those mighty times, there was so much going on. But after the children were bombed, the church was bombed in Birmingham, and the 4 little girls, their charred bodies were found in the church, and they were about the same ages as me and my sisters. Bayard Rustin, who was a leader of the civil rights movement, he put out a letter saying that we should all wear black armbands to mourn the little girls who had been killed by the KKK. And so there was a memorial service in Des Moines, and people wore black armbands, and these things were all going on at the same time. So by 1965 then, also the day that Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman were killed in Mississippi Freedom Summer, also by the Klan, and their bodies were discovered on August 4th, 1964, which was the same exact day that the Gulf of Tonkin incident happened, where a U.S. Navy ship off the shore of Vietnam claimed that it had been attacked, and it turns out it hadn't been attacked, but the Congress then voted almost unanimously to send thousands of troops to Vietnam. So by 1965, there had been about 1,000 U.S. soldiers killed in Vietnam, and the war was starting to build up, and LBJ was, the Gulf of Tonkin incident had been his reason, I guess, that he was looking for, because they were already sending troops, but now they could really send more and more thousands of troops. And I'm sure a lot of you have family in the Vietnam War who had been in the Vietnam War, and so you all know how emotional this all was. And we saw the news of the children running from their burning huts, the soldiers lying on the ground, the body bags, the report every night on the news, how many soldiers were killed. And it was very moving and emotional for us. So when we decided to wear the black armbands, it wasn't an easy decision. I was a very shy girl, and a small group of students in Des Moines there organized this effort. And I was one of the youngest ones, but I wasn't sure if I should do it. But I had been inspired by these kids I saw in Birmingham, just like kids now are inspired by some of the students they might have seen in Black Lives Matter or various other ways that students have been standing up and speaking up. So I decided that I would wear a black armband, and then I went to my math class, and my teacher was there waiting and sent me to the office. In a great stand of courage and conviction, when he asked me to take off the armband, I did. In about 5 seconds. And then I was suspended anyway. So 5 students were suspended. My brother John, Chris Eckhart, and 2 others were suspended. But then the haters started coming out of the woodwork, threatening to bomb our house, throwing red paint at our house. A lady called and threatened to kill me. They would call us communists. My mom would always say, "We're not communists, we're Methodists." But I'll have to say, one group that stood by us, that came to help us, was the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. And this was an ACLU case, as all 4 of the cases, ours and 3 since having to do with student speech rights at the Supreme Court, have all been ACLU cases. The ACLU goes to the Supreme Court more than any organization in the United States because of its commitment to the Bill of Rights. And I mean, with all due respect to Alan Dershowitz, who just was saying in his interview that the ACLU has become, you know, a villain to free speech, I don't see that at all. I see the ACLU also making itself very unpopular with some liberals as well as conservatives. They always have been very true to their mission to stand up for the First Amendment. They defended Milo Yiannopoulos recently, who you know, calls feminism a cancer. They've defended students that are against gay rights. They've defended students that are for gay rights.
Okay, but let me get back for a second to your case, because I don't want to lose this piece of it.
Yeah.
Did you go to the Supreme Court for your argument?
Yes, we did. The ACLU stood by us, and we went to, they said first you have to negotiate, which I always advise students, if you have a disagreement, try to negotiate. We did that, but the school board wouldn't change their mind. So it went to the district court where we lost, and it went to the appeals court where we lost. But interestingly, right around that time, some students in Mississippi who had protested the murder by the KKK of the 3 civil rights workers there, they won their case. They had worn buttons to school to protest the murder of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, and they won their case. So now you had 2 circuits with different opinions about students' rights. So it was a perfect setup. That was called Burnside. And they won at the circuit level because the courts in Mississippi, the 5th Circuit, said that they had not substantially disrupted school. So that's where your substantial disruption in schools standard comes from. It's from Mississippi Freedom Summer. And so it was appealed to the Supreme Court. Then they take very few cases. They take around 80, I think, a year.
And what do you remember feeling the day that they handed down the decision saying that the First Amendment did protect your rights after all these years of litigating?
I was so surprised because I was a kid, and I thought there's no way these big important judges are going to say that kids have rights. But you know, I've found since that there are many allies, adult allies of children and teenagers, and it really is a children's rights case, which is an international human rights issue, because young people have so many issues they need to stand up about. I'm a pediatric nurse. I've spent many years as a nurse working with teenagers, and their status isn't so great in our society. They are more likely to live in poverty. Our infant mortality rate is one of the worst in the developed world. We have an increase in teen homelessness, all of these issues that youth really need rights to speak up and stand up about, whether it's you know, pollution, climate change, racial issues in their schools, and so many other things that affect their lives, and they should have a right to use the First Amendment. So I'm glad that the Supreme Court said that they do have rights.
Well, I appreciate it very much hearing from both of you, and because we're all about education, our last segment, and we're going to come in 5 minutes early to keep the program moving, as I promised I would try to do. But this is a great segue because both of these cases are really about education in a very real sense. And we're now going to talk about institutions here and organizations that help to educate the public, which I know you are working hard at.
Yes.
Mary Beth, and that Shawn, you believe in very strongly. So ladies and gentlemen, can we have a round of applause for a hero of the First Amendment and a historian of the First Amendment?